Hello and welcome to another Magic Duels gameplay. Today we're taking a look at an Esper colored control deck, so white, blue and black. So a deck full of counter spells, removal spells, and then mostly Planeswalkers as finishers. So let's dive right into it with Jace, Vryn's Prodigy, just a great card in a deck full of fetch lands and instants and sorceries, as we'll fill up the graveyard quickly. He can give us some card selection on the front side, flip into Jace Telepath Unbound, which can control the board or flashback instants and sorceries for some nice card advantage. Next up is a new addition, Thing in the Eyes, a pretty interesting card. 1 and a blue for an 0/4 defender, comes into play with 4 ice counters, and whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, we can remove an ice counter, and then once we remove all of the ice counters, we get the Awoken Horror, which is a 7/8, and when he transforms, he also returns all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands, and if we already had the Thing in the Eyes in play, that means he no longer has summoning sickness, so can attack right away for 7 points of damage. So just a pretty devastating effect, and of course we have a deck full of instants and sorceries, so it should not be too difficult to get all the ice counters removed, and in the meantime we get an 0/4 defender that can help protect our planeswalkers, for example. Next up we have an instant speed removal spell in Gideon's Reproach, 1 and a white to deal 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Not an amazing effect, but it's pretty cheap and helps us deal with those creature lands, for example, that can otherwise be difficult to deal with since sorcery speed removal is not gonna be able to deal with them, and a card like Anguished Unmaking can't target lands. So Gideon's Reproach is one of the few ways we have to deal with those creature lands effectively, and of course can also deal with other creatures. Next up is a Telling Time, an instant for 1 and a blue to provide us some card selection, so won't actually provide card advantage, but can help us look for the card we need in a certain situation. Also important that it's an instant, so we can keep up counter spells, and if the opponent doesn't play anything worth countering, we can just Telling Time end of turn, so we still use our mana, and also an instant to go with Thing in the Eyes. Next up is Grasp of Darkness, which is a better removal spell than Gideon's Reproach, but we only get to play 3 of them, so that's why we have the 2 Gideon's Reproaches as well. This one a little bit tougher on the mana, however, so double black to give a creature -4/-4 until end of turn at instant speed, so clearly better than Gideon's Reproach since also shrinks the power, and you don't have to wait for the creature to be attacking or blocking before you can use it, which can be very relevant. Next up is Declaration in Stone, which is yet another cheap removal spell. This one is a sorcery, however, and will exile a creature an opponent controls and all the creatures that share the same name, and then the opponent gets to investigate or get a clue token for every non-token creature we exiled. But if we do happen to exile tokens, then the opponent does not get to investigate, so this card is pretty nice against multiple of the same tokens. Not great in a control deck, since we are essentially giving our opponent card advantage by letting them investigate, and the games will go long, so they will have time to sacrifice those clue tokens. So Declaration in Stone certainly better in more aggressive decks, but I think it's still worth keeping in the deck since it is good against tokens and also exiles the creatures, since there are some indestructible creatures running around like Ulamog, so Declaration is a nice answer there. Next up we get to our counter spells, starting out with Scatter to the Winds, 1 and double blue to counter a spell. We can also awaken it for 6 mana if we want to turn a land into a 3/3 creature, but usually just a counter spell is good enough. And then we also have a Broken Concentration, which is also 1 and double blue to counter a spell, and also has Madness, which has a few corner cases. For example, you can discard it to a Jace, Vryn's Prodigy and still Madness it out and counterspell for 4 mana, but most of the time this is just gonna be 1 and double blue to counter spell, which is essentially a cancel, which is good enough. So that gives us access to 5 hard counter spells, so we don't need to play any of those conditional counter spells. Next up we get Anguished Unmaking, 1 a black and a white for an instant that exiles target non-land permanent, and we lose 3 life, which is a pretty big cost. But this one is pretty versatile since we can exile enchantments, planeswalkers, artifacts, as well as creatures, so it gives us a lot of flexibility and an answer to otherwise problematic cards, like for example Sphinx's Tutelage, which does see some amount of play still. And next up is Kalitas, Traitor of Ghet, one of our win conditions, 2 and double black for a 3/4 life linker, which is nice, since control decks usually want some ways to gain back some life, and whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, it gets exiled instead, and we get a 2/2 zombie token, and then for 2 and a black we can sacrifice one of those zombie tokens to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Kalitas to grow our life linker, which can be pretty nice, and maybe get him out of reach of some of the removal spells in the format. So Kalitas doesn't really shine in this deck, since we have a lot of removal spells that exile the opponent's creatures, and if we do exile them then we don't get the zombie token, but I think it's still worth running just because it is such a powerful card, and in combination with our other removal spells it's still fine, and a 3/4 lifelinker for 4 mana you could do a lot worse. Then we get to some of our card advantage cards here. Comparative Analysis, 3 and a blue for an instant that lets us draw 2 cards, and then we can also surge it out, so if we cast another spell in the same turn we can cast it for 1 less mana, so usually just 4 mana at the end step of the opponent to draw 2 cards if they didn't cast anything worth countering, so that we can get some card advantage, since otherwise the only way to gain card advantage is by maybe casting sweepers, getting multiple creatures killed with 1 spell, or with our Planeswalkers providing multiple activations and maybe drawing us cards that way. So Comparative Analysis is another card that can draw some extra cards and win the late game. Speaking of sweepers, we have 2 copies of Languish, just -4/-4 to all creatures until end of turn, to wipe up the board and protect our Planeswalkers, for example. Then we also have a Gideon, ally of Zendikar, just a very solid Planeswalker that can close out games pretty quickly. Not particularly synergistic in this deck, but usually we will play him, then use the 0 ability to make a Knight ally token, and then if the board is in a position where we can attack, then we can +1 Gideon to make him into a 5/5 that is also indestructible, and then we can attack with him as well as the token, or we can just make tokens every turn, which is good enough. And we could also ultimate him, but that's not going to be great in this deck, to give all creatures we control +1/+1 for the rest of the game. We are also playing with Archangel Avacyn, which is great in this deck since it's a creature with flash, so we can play it at instant speed, so works very well in combination with our counterspells and instant speed removal spells. Flying Vigilance, so can attack while still staying on defense and protecting our Planeswalkers, and when we cast her, creatures we control gain indestructible until end of turn, which is not the most relevant text in this deck. And then when a non-angel creature we control dies, we get to transform Avacyn, and she becomes Avacyn the Purifier, which deals damage to all other creatures, so also includes our creatures, but we don't have a lot of them that will die to this effect. And also then a 6/5 flyer, which will close out the game very quickly. We have a final counterspell in Confirm Suspicions. This one is expensive at 5 mana, but we do get to counter a spell and then investigate 3 times, so in a long game we can sacrifice those clues to get lots of card advantage, which is pretty nice. Then 2 more sweepers in Planar Outburst to destroy all non-land creatures. We can also awaken this in the late game to get a hasty 4/4 land. Then we get to some of our Planeswalkers. We have a Jace, Unraveler of Secrets, usually gonna +1 him a bunch of times to scry 1 and draw cards, but we can also bounce creatures and his ultimate can be pretty nice as well. Then pretty similarly to Jace we have Ob Nixilis Reignited, which +1 lets us draw cards, then the minus can deal with creatures and the ultimate can also close out the game. We've got another sweet creature in Linvala the Preserver, which is excellent in a control deck. 6 mana for a 5/5 flyer, and if we're behind on life, we gain 5 life. If we're behind on the board, we get a 3/3 angel token, so does all the things this deck wants to do. And then finally one more Planeswalker in Sorin Grim Nemesis, which also provides card advantage with the +1, deals with creatures with the minus ability, and the ultimate can also close out the game. And then our mana base, 3 plains, 4 islands, 3 swamps, to Shambling Vent, which is important, that can turn into a lifelinking creature. Then to Sunken Hollow, to Prairie Stream, to Drowned Catacomb, to Isolated Chapel, to Glacial Fortress, and finally 4 Evolving Wilds. So that's the deck, and now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, let's take a look at our opener, which looks very interesting. We'll get to see if Thing in the Ice is any good, since we'll have 2 telling times to go with them. So let's keep this one and try it out. Opponent on Lumbering Falls, which is definitely a problematic creature. And next turn we can play one of our basics or Glacial Fortress into Thing in the Ice. And then go from there. Alright, another island. And no play. So Thing in the Ice could get countered here by a Horribly Awry, but we have a second one, so I think it's alright to run one out there. So let's play Swamp into Thing in the Ice. Resolves, that's good. And maybe our opponent has a telling time, nope. Just no turn to play. Looks like they're more of an aggro tempo deck with Eldrazi Sky Spawner, making a Scion token. So do we want to play a second Thing in the Ice, or do we want to get the ball rolling and cast Telling Time to get some counters off of the first Thing in the Ice? I think it's probably fine to play another Thing in the Ice first, since then next turn we can cast 2 Telling Times. Otherwise, if we cast Telling Time, we could look for a counterspell for next turn. Definitely an interesting decision point, but I kind of like the idea of having 2 Thing in the Ice out there. And now I think I do play the Glacial Fortress, just in case we need that white mana somehow. So our opponent can attack us for 2 in the air. So we'll go to 18. But we already have 4 instants and sorceries lined up. And Grasp of Darkness, a nice addition. So yeah, we just get to play a land and pass a turn. And we have a nice selection of instants and sorceries here. Opponent plays a Dimensional Infiltrator, which I think will grasp before opponent gets the opportunity to maybe... Well, I guess our opponent could sacrifice a Scion plus use a land to maybe get this back. So I think I just grasp the Sky Spawner so we don't take too much damage in the air. And then we still get to keep up Telling Time end of turn. Opponent with a Disperse, alright. So they get to return the Sky Spawner. So they will be able to cast it again next turn. But at least we won't get hit for 2 this turn, plus this sets them back on tempo a little bit. So buys us some time. And if we find a cheap instance, we might already be able to transform our 2 Things in the Ice next turn. Which would be pretty nice. Pretty nice. So cast Telling Time. There's a Broken Concentration, which I would not mind, but won't be able to really cast it. Anguished Unmaking seems pretty bad here. So I guess I'll take the Broken Concentration plus the Evolving Wilds. And now we get to sit back on our counterspell, and otherwise we can cast the Analysis. And this one's gonna get a Plains. And we can also use Evolving Wilds in combination with Telling Time to shuffle away potentially bad cards. Clutch of Currents. That's not very nice. I think we kind of want to counter this, as weird as it may seem. Yeah, let's counter it. Does our opponent have a counter? Yes, they do. So one of our things in the ice will get returned, but the second one will be able to transform next turn. So it's not all bad. Let's get our planes here. And the interesting thing here is that Thing in the Ice is a horror. So playing the second Thing in the Ice will not get it bounced by the first one, which is a nice bonus. So I think here, let's see. So I kind of like casting Telling Time, transforming Thing in the Ice, attacking for 7. So let's go for it. Actually, we could just surge out this Comparative Analysis, which might just be better. So draw 2 cards. Bounce all non-horror creatures. And attack for 7. Put up our opponent at 13. And we could be transforming the second Thing in the Ice pretty quickly as well. So does our opponent have an answer for the Awoken Horror? They have a Frostlinks to tap it down for a turn, which is fine. And they're probably gonna play the Infiltrator end of turn here. But now we have our counterspells at the ready. So let's see, yeah, no, I don't think I like casting Ob Nixilis here. We can just sit on Confirm Suspicions plus Telling Time. And I think we do use the Confirm Suspicion here, now that our opponent can't counter our counterspell. And it's not like we can keep up multiple counters anyways. So yeah, let's pass the turn. There's the Infiltrator. We can confirm Suspicions, counter it, and get 3 clue tokens. And now we have the option of either sacrificing a clue or casting Telling Time. Opponent replays the Sky Spawner. And no attacks, and I think we Telling Time here just to remove another counter. Opponent has Grip of the Royal. Alright, so they're gonna tap down our Thing in the Ice, and it won't untap, and we find counter spells and removal spells, which is basically what we want here. So yeah, I think we kind of just sit on our counters here. If we attack with the Horror, our opponent likely chumps with the Scion token. Yeah, and even if we transform this Thing in the Ice, it's still gonna be tapped down, so won't be able to attack. Playing Ob Nixilis and minusing is also not terrible, since we can still use Gideon's Reproach. And then our opponent kind of also has to deal with Ob Nixilis. The downside is we don't get to keep up our counterspells, which I think are nice here just to protect our horrors, which will close out the game pretty quickly. So sitting back on 2 counterspells or counterspell and a Gideon's Reproach seems decent. Let's start by attacking and seeing how our opponent wants to block here, if at all. Opponent does indeed chump. So to Ob Nixilis or not to Ob Nixilis? I think we just pass and sit on our counter spells and removal spells, and plus we also have all these clues that we get to sacrifice. So your opponent attacks. If we Gideon's Reproach, the creatures won't get killed, but they'll get bounced first. So they would be able to replay the creatures. But I think that's still fine. So let's cast Gideon's Reproach, flip Thing in the Eyes, return those 2 creatures. Opponent doesn't deal any damage. And they replay Frostlings, which we will scatter here. And looks like that's gonna do it. Our opponent did, however, have a Clutch of Currents to bounce one of our horrors. Sacrifice a clue. Opponent's gonna take 7 down to 6. Linvala is also a nice one. We could play her now to gain 5 life instead of not gaining the life after we attack. But I think if we just hold on to this Broken Concentration, that's going to be better. So we can play Thing in the Ice first. Attack for 7. And then just sit on Broken Concentration plus the 2 clues. Opponent recasts the Sky Spawner, which we will counter. Opponent has another Grip of the Royal to tap down our horror. Can draw a card with our clue. Another counterspell. Two counterspells. Yeah, I think we just sit on our 2 counters again. Again, we could play Ob Nixilis plus keep up a counterspell, but I kind of just want to get this game over with. And I don't think our opponent will have 2 answers to the horror at this point. Plus we can also sacrifice our clue. An Awoken, Clutch of Currents, we can just counter, could even awaken our own Scatter to the Winds, but there's no reason to. And our opponent passes, just draw yet another card. And also an interesting thing you can do in corner cases is use your own counterspells on your own spells, just to be able to cast another instant and maybe remove an ice counter from the Thing in the Ice. So we could, for example, play Ob Nixilis, counter it with Scatter to the Winds, and remove another counter if that would be helpful. But that's not going to be necessary. So attack for 7 and move on to the next one. Okay, let's take a look at our opening hand, which looks decent. Evolving Wilds can get a plane, so we can cast Anguished Unmaking. Plus we have Telling Time to find what we need. Yeah, I think this is keepable. And I think I'll play this right away in case we... this is actually interesting. Evolving Wilds might also want to get an island in case we find a counterspell. But we'll kind of have to wait. Maybe inform our decision based on what our opponent does turn 1 here. Our opponent also with Evolving Wilds, and they're gonna sacrifice it right away, so maybe gives us a little bit of information to work with. They get a swamp. Alright. I think I want to get a plains here. We also have a lot more blue sources than white sources. So should we draw a counterspell like we just did, we still should be able to find a second blue source, although by getting the plains we will not be able to cast our Telling Time or Thing in the Ice here. So maybe I sequenced things a little bit poorly, could have played Drowned Catacomb turn 1, then next turn Swamp, and then cast either Thing in the Ice or Telling Time, and then the third turn sacrifice the Evolving Wilds. Opponent on green-black with Sylvan Advocate, so pretty powerful card. But we find a Grasp of Darkness. I kind of like getting the Thing in the Ice out there, since it can also just block the Sylvan Advocate, could draw a removal spell from our opponent. And we don't really have to use a Grasp if the Thing in the Ice can hold back the Sylvan Advocate successfully. So let's cast Thing in the Ice and pass the turn. And then next turn, probably casting Telling Time, looking for some lands. Best draw would probably just be an island or an untapped blue source, so we can keep up Scatter to the Winds. Alright, looks like they're also playing whites, and they have a Nissa, which we luckily can answer with Anguished Unmaking. Otherwise, Planeswalkers can be problematic to deal with as a control deck. So, opponent can attack, but we'll just block, so this is kind of a waste of time. If our opponent attacked in the first main phase, then there's some strategic value to maybe not blocking, but our opponent tapped out, so... alright. I kind of want to Anguished Unmaking the Nissa right away, but plant tokens aren't really bothering me, and I don't think our opponent is gonna minus Nissa next turn to put counters on creatures, so might as well keep the Anguished Unmaking in hand for now, and play the Plains. That way, if our opponent plays maybe a Gideon next turn that we would want to Anguished Unmaking instead, then we get to do that instead of getting rid of Nissa. So let's pass. Unfortunately, can't Telling Time plus Grasp of Darkness here. But let's see what our opponent does here. It's a tapped Shambling Vent and an Evolutionary Leap, which is a very big problem for us since our opponent can start sacrificing all those tokens and generates a ton of card advantage. Problem is, this is gonna resolve, so our opponent's gonna get at least one activation out of it. Opponent is going to plus Nissa, and I think I want to Anguished Unmaking here the Evolutionary Leap instead of the Nissa, since it's gonna be harder for us to remove the Leap than it is the Nissa, and we might be able to remove all 3 ice counters from the Thing in the Ice to just attack Nissa. Opponent found a Sage of Ancient Lore and 2 lands away from giving this +2/+2, as well as all other land creatures. So we do have some time to get rid of Nissa here before she reaches her ultimate, at which point her opponent will draw a ton of cards. Alright, so still no lands, unfortunately. So I kind of want to cast Telling Time just to look for some lands. There's a Broken Concentration, an Island, and an Evolving Wilds. So I think I'll get the Island here, plus the Broken Concentration, which... maybe we get the Evolving Wilds instead. Let's see, we don't have any islands in play, so we won't be able to cast a Scatter. So I think I'll draw the Evolving Wilds, put the Broken Concentration on top, and then this will fetch an island. And then shuffle away the Broken Concentration, which I don't think we need right now, since we already have a scatter. So 5 lands for our opponents. Shambling Vent is gonna turn into a creature. And Nissa is gonna minus to put counters on all creatures. And is going to attack us for 7, but we can block 3 of that damage. So we'll only take 4. Opponent gains 3, sacrifice Evolving Wilds, get an island, shuffle away the cards we didn't need that were on top. And a land is nice, so what now? We could Grasp of Darkness, the Sylvan Advocate, before our opponent gets to play land number 6, and give this +2/+2, which I think is reasonable. We won't be able to, well actually we do get to keep up Scatter, since we can just play the Chapel. And then, yeah, if our opponent does play something worth countering, this will transform. And then Languish becomes a lot better. So I think that's the plan here. Grasp the Advocate. Advocate dies, 1 counter left. And if our opponent tries to kill the thing in the ice, we can also protect it. Alright, so in a decent spot, but there's a lot of things our opponent can do that could be problematic. Sage of Ancient Lore. I think I like scattering this. Although, let's see, this will be a 5/5. So the question is, do we want to just Languish? If we scatter now, our opponent still gets to make a plant afterwards. So then if we attack with the thing in the ice that's transformed, our opponent can chum block. So I think I like countering this. Otherwise, if our opponent then replays this, also gets to draw a card and uses our mana efficiently here. There's definitely an argument to just letting that resolve and then maybe casting Languish. But now if our opponent makes a plant, we can Ob Nixilis, kill the plant, kill Nissa. Although at that point we risk losing Ob Nixilis to the Shambling Vent. But Anguished Unmaking is another interesting card here. So we could Languish, get rid of the plants. This will have 3 power. So won't actually be able to kill Nissa. So maybe we just Ob Nixilis and draw a card and don't bother attacking, since our opponent can jump and then attack with Shambling Vent, so would rather have this on defense. So I think resolving Ob Nixilis here while our opponent doesn't have any pressure is good. So let's draw a card. Alright, Gideon's Reproach is nice, since that can answer an attack from Shambling Vent at the moment. So I think we skip attacks here. Shambling Vent does have a +1/+1 counter, so will be a 3/4 if it becomes a creature. So should our opponent be able to put another counter on it, then the Reproach can't kill it anymore. So it's kind of on the opponent here to do something, because we have the better board state at the moment. And if our opponent plays a bunch of creatures, then Languish will be great. Liliana is the play. So when a non-token creature dies, if our opponent activates Shambling Vent and attacks Ob Nixilis and we block, for example, then Liliana will transform. Opponent's gonna put +1/+1 counters everywhere. So do they attack just to transform Liliana, or they are going to attack? So our opponent could force us to discard, which would be fine, or they could get back a Sylvan Advocate, which would also be fine. So I think blocking is just fine here. Don't really mind Liliana transforming, since we have this Anguished Unmaking, which can also deal with a Planeswalker. And this way we got rid of a Shambling Vent. So I'm not saying that the attack was incorrect. It could be that our opponent really wants this Liliana transformed, which is reasonable. And our opponent is going to get back the Sylvan Advocate, which is now a 4/5. Alright, so now we have tons of options. A Languish certainly looks appealing here, since it would get rid of 2 tokens, and then if our opponent wants to protect one of the Planeswalkers, they lose the Sylvan Advocate. We could also Ob Nixilis plus Languish, that way we kill one of the Planeswalkers for sure, which might be better. Then the question is, which Planeswalker would we rather kill? I think Liliana is more problematic than Nissa. So yeah, I kind of just like making sure here. Kill Sylvan Advocate, cast a Languish, which will also shrink the horror, but still enough to kill one of the Planeswalkers, and we'll kill Liliana instead of Nissa. And opponent has 3 cards left, and we have a pretty good hand and a better board state, so don't hate the spot we're in. Opponent on 7 lands. They're gonna make a token and cast a Reclamation Sage with no real target, so just a 2/1. Alright. And there's a Sorin, which is also pretty nice. So let's see here. Do we want to Archangel Avacyn? Well, I think we should start by probably plussing Ob Nixilis here. To draw a card, have some more options. Alright, broken calculation, so now we have a counterspell added into the mix. So we could Anguished Unmaking the Nissa, but I kind of like holding on to this. Could resolve Sorin now that our opponent doesn't have a lot of pressure in play. And I'm plussing Sorin. What's the worst that could happen? So attack. Well, let's see. Yeah, if we attack Nissa, opponent has to chump. So they don't have the option of putting counters on the creatures and then attacking Ob Nixilis. So they are going to chump block, get to play Sorin, and plus him. I think we would rather want to plus him than kill the Reclamation Sage. And we found a swamp, which we'll play. Alright, so now we have 2 active Planeswalkers, a 7/8 creature, and if we get to untap, we'll have access to a counterspell. Opponent has Ob Nixilis, which can kill our Awoken Horror. Instead going for the +1, which is interesting. So maybe our opponent is looking for a specific card that can help them in this situation. But I think that killing the horror might have been better there. Nissa's gonna make a plant, which I guess stops the horror from doing too much. So I guess that's also reasonable. But now we get to Anguished Unmaking the Ob Nixilis. Could also just use Sorin, the minus ability. But yeah, now Reclamation Sage attacking Sorin means we'll only have 5 loyalty, which is not enough to kill the Ob Nixilis with Sorin. Alright, so let's see, we have access to 7 mana. So that means we could Avacyn plus cast a 2 mana spell, but I kind of want to use the Anguished Unmaking and keep up the Broken Concentration. So I think I will use Sorin to kill Nissa, use Anguished Unmaking to get rid of Ob Nixilis, and then we still get to draw a card, since we'll also gain some life here with Sorin. So 4 over there. Maybe should have drawn a card first just to get the extra information. Kalitas is not bad. So now we get to Anguished Unmaking Ob Nixilis. And I think we just... let's see. Yeah, I think we stay on defense, since if we attack, then opponent can jump, and then they can attack Sorin with Reclamation Sage, which would force us to use Gideon's Reproach, and then we would not have the Broken Concentration available. Instead, if we wait one more turn, we can have all the shields up, and we're not really in a hurry to kill our opponent anyways. Ever After, returning 2 creatures from their graveyard, would be Liliana and Sylvan Advocate. That's not going to happen. So the Ever After gets countered, in which case it's not put on the bottom, since it did not resolve. Opponent has 1 card left, and now we're in pretty good shape. So I think we can start by plussing Sorin. Find a Jace plus Ob Nixilis. We do have to keep our life total in mind, of course. So now we can attack with the Horror. Opponent likely jumps with the plant. And I think I'll just... let's see, we could play Jace. But my plan is to cast the Avacyn end of turn here. So we could also cast a Thing in the Ice, or we could cast a Telling Time, and I think I'll keep up Telling Time here, just in case that we maybe have to look for a specific card in this turn, but looks like that's not going to be the case. Reclamation Sage attacks, we can flash in Avacyn, keep up blue and white mana here. So even if our opponent has removal for Avacyn, we could still Gideon's Reproach. The Reclamation Sage will block. And Telling Time, end of turn. And Shambling Vent is a nice one, as it can gain us some life. And I think I want a Declaration, since that can deal with indestructible creatures should our opponent be playing Ulamog in their deck. So now we get to plus Sorin. Also, Telling Time plus Sorin is kind of a combo, since you can put a high casting cost card on top and then plus Sorin to reveal it to deal more damage to the opponent, so I didn't really think of that here. Let's see, what else can we do? Think we can still plus Ob Nixilis. Draw a Grasp. Attack for 11. Put our opponent at 10. And since we don't have a counterspell quite yet, I don't think we cast Kalitas, since then we get owned by a sweeper. So I think I'll just play a Jace. And then that leaves us still with Grasp of Darkness up, which should be good enough here. +1. Island, don't really need that. Play Shambling Vent and pass the turn. Might have to discard a card end of turn here. Let's get rid of the analysis, since we have enough card draw with all our Planeswalkers. I think Tragic Arrogance is probably one of the better cards they could play here, but it's not even that devastating, since we have 2 great creatures and 3 great Planeswalkers in play. And it looks like we got the job done. So now we can attack for 11 and call it a day. Alright, sweet. I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this gameplay. And as always, have a nice day.